Cameras. Every smartphone has them, or usually about 4 or 5 of the buggers these days actually. And some of them are good and some of them are not quite as good. And this intro sucks. And what I'm trying to say is that I've personally tested and reviewed loads of smartphones and I've picked out the ones that boast the best camera experience and results for this lovely wee roundup. So enough blather, here's the video, and for more videos like this video, please do poke subscribe and ding that notifications bell. Cheers! So one of the most obvious choices for proper good smartphone optics is Google's Pixel 8 series. Both the regular model and that posh Pro version if you've got loads of cash to spaff on your next smartphone. These flagship blows are less expensive than some rivals, but they serve up some seriously slick hardware, as well as a shagload of excellent Pixel exclusive features that make life just that wee bit easier, including the obligatory AI shenanigans. That Tensor chipset isn't as beefy as Qualcomm's latest Snapdragon, but the Pixel 8 phones can still blaze through a bit of Genshin Impact on demand. And when it comes to the cameras, that primary sensor hasn't changed up at all from last year's 50MP Octa-PD quad-beer effort. And the Pixel 8 Pro has a few little bonus features that you won't find in the regular Pixel 8, a few more settings, so tap your way into Pro. You can change up the resolution from 12 megapixel to the maximum 50 meg. In here you've also got manual lens selection, and you've also got the ability to shoot in RAW format, as well as good old JPEG. But as usual, for the majority of my testing, I just stuck it in full auto, just like the average consumer, and to be honest, on the Pixel 8 Pro, that's more than good enough. Thankfully, these days, I rarely get any bewildering grainy images, something which really plagued this phone up until roughly Christmas time. Although every so often you will see some weird distortion or general cackness that could only be caused by the post-processing shenanigans. Still, the Pixel 8 Pro mostly laughs in the face of high contrast and waves its willy at low light scenarios. Other phones may have more swanky sounding optics on paper, but Google knows how to add a bit of virtual spit and polish to your snaps. So you end up with natural looking results boasting realistic tones, rich contrast and no fallout, such as overly saturated HDR photos. The Pixel 8 Pro also has a pretty big advantage over the regular non-Pro model with that 48MP telephoto shooter, capable of 5x optical zoom. This makes a serious difference when you're zooming in, especially as the Pro could get you much closer, maxing out at 30x zoom. No, it's not as impressive as Samsung's Galaxy S24 Ultra, and photos certainly get a bit smudgy when you zoom past the 20x level, but it's great for getting closer to your subject without getting all up in their face. And you've also got yourself an ultra-wide option here on the Pixel 8 Pro. It's a 48MP quad-beer sensor with a wider aperture than the regular Pixel 8. And this is certainly one of the better ultra-wides I've tested, offering that pulled-back dramatic viewpoint without any real compromise to the tones, and not a horrific amount of distortion around the edges. Now, if you want to shoot a bit of home movie action, well, there's no 8K abilities here on the Pixel 8 Pro, but honestly, who gives a flying about that? You can record up to 4K video with decent stabilization and excellent audio capture. You'll be rewarded with crisp, clear vocals even when there's a fair bit of background shindiggery going on. And you can even edit out any excess noise after the fact, but more on all that in a bit. And here in the Pro model, you've also got an exclusive video boost tool, which is really handy if the lighting is cack. And fair play, this really helps to brighten up your footage when you're shooting in dimmer conditions and produces more natural looking tones as well. It's not a massive leap, but it is good stuff at the cost of long processing times. And then finally up front, you've got a 10MP selfie shooter, and oh my god, I look rough today. Got a good bit of autofocus action, and it's absolutely fine most of the time as long as the lighting isn't cack. But of course, where the Pixel 8 Pro really excels is the photo editing capabilities, including the new magic editing tool. This can tweak a photo on your behalf, make it look as good as possible, and as always, the ability to erase objects in photos is just bafflingly good. The way that the AI fills in the gaps is just, scary, man. The unblur tool, sadly, still rather limited. It certainly can't work miracles. More useful is the new portrait light feature, which allows you to tweak the light and just balance it out in portrait shots. It's particularly handy if you've got a really bright background or your subject is a bit saturated, but to be honest, rarely happens with shots here on the Pixel 8 Pro anyway. And if you're shooting video in quite blustery conditions or somewhere outdoors where there's a lot of background noise, you've also got that excellent audio eraser feature, which can just siphon out all of that background crap. Really does work impressively well. And if you can't afford these shiny wee blighters, well, no need to resort to yanking out Grand's gold teeth just yet. Google's mid-range Pixel 7a smartphone is considerably cheaper and yet still boasts some rather spiffy camera action. The Pixel 7a rocks a 64MP Sony IMX787 sensor set alongside your typical ultra-wide-angle shooter. This new hardware, combined with Google's image processing chops, is a solid combo in most circumstances, so I was happy enough with the majority of my test photos. The lens does a dependable job of locking onto your subject following an update, even if the scene is rather messy, while images are impressively lifelike rather than manipulated to look more pleasing to the eye. If it's a sunny day, you'll have to be a little bit careful to avoid any lens flare, but otherwise the Pixel 7a can cope well with harsh backlighting. HDR ain't a problem, with blue skies capably captured. Those portrait chops are pretty decent too. This phone can even deal with crazy windswept hair and furry subjects like this wee chap. Ambient snaps can look a little bit soft at times, those textures and facial features can be just a wee bit too smooth, but colours are usually on point, and as long as there's no rapid movement then you'll get sharp enough results. My indoor pics had plenty of finer details packed in there. Your manual controls are limited to EV and contrast basically. If you want anything more complex than that, then you're going to have to look at an alternative blower, but those on-screen sliders work really well and they can rescue an otherwise murky looking shot. And this comes in handy at times in the evenings, although this blower does a solid job there too. Strong lighting can pose a problem in a night scenario, but otherwise it's all good. We're talking not much noise and a reasonable amount of detail. Now that 13MP ultra-wide-angle shooter is another Sony IMX special, and photos shot with this are rather consistent, once again producing natural tones just like the primary shooter, if not quite as much detail. Although unfortunately the distortion is rather bad, which heavily distracts. The Pixel 7a can also record up to 4K resolution video, and it's certainly fine if not remarkable in this department. Visuals are sharp and well defined as long as you're not shooting in the dark, and even in the evenings you'll usually get something that works. That focus still occasionally pops, especially if the lighting sucks, but the stabilization is good enough for moving about and recording, even at that Ultra HD level. Audio capture is also good as long as the environment isn't too noisy and there's not much wind. And last up, that 13MP selfie snapper is okay-ish. It's not the worst, but it's pretty bog standard stuff, pumping out soft, bland snaps if the lighting ain't great. If you're obsessed with posting pics of your gun and mug online, you may be swayed by another handset like the Galaxy A54. A hot rival for these Pixel phones comes courtesy of Apple with its latest iPhone 15 series smartphones. As usual, if you want the beefiest hardware, you'll need to spunk out $1,000 or more for the Pro or Pro Max models. Personally, I've played with the Pro Max. Now, when it first launched, this absolute brick was a temperamental furnace that singed my thigh hairs several times a day. Thankfully, these thermal issues have calmed down after several updates, and as usual, the camera tech will please most people who try it, with Apple's usual post-processing smarts on board. The primary sensor here is a 48MP shooter with optical image stabilization. You've got a choice of capturing 12MP or 24MP images, which is a setting which is buried away in the actual phone settings rather than the camera settings still for some reason. And if you want to, you can once again shoot in Pro RAW format if you want to edit your pics on the fly. And in regular daylight, the iPhone 15 Pro Max does rather well. All of my test photos were crammed with finer detail, even when you crop right in there. And that's especially true when you're shooting 24MP images. That camera can accurately capture colours with only the occasional warm tones, and my pics in bright light certainly weren't as saturated as the results from some bitter rivals like Samsung. As ever, Apple's latest blower does tend to artificially boost darker regions in HDR situations, so everything will appear clear and bright, which isn't ideal if you're after a realistic atmospheric image. But for everyday snaps, that post-processing is a guaranteed crowd pleaser. The iPhone 15 Pro Max's focus usually works well even in dim light, although some of my test snaps were surprisingly soft. At night or indoors, this phone can still pump out pics with respectable detail, not too much noise at all, although the sharpness isn't always quite on point. And any light sources do tend to flare up as usual, so night shots can look a bit gash compared with some rivals. And like with most phones, you will get blurry results when your subject just won't stay still. Portrait mode is a cracker as always. You've got a variety of filters you can flick between, and it always serves up some strong, dependable bokeh action. And I gotta say, I absolutely adore the iPhone's sticker tool, which is easy to use, it always works really well, and frankly, it's hilarious. Now the 12 meg ultra wide angle shooter offers a more dramatic angle, and it is a very similar story for the picture quality compared with the primary sensors. Those tones aren't quite as accurately represented here, but it's a fairly minor difference. As for that 12 meg 120mm telephoto lens, well, this serves up a 5x optical zoom and hits the ceiling at 25x zoom. Although if you do zoom all the way in, things do get a bit abstract at times. The iPhone 15 Pro Max is still inferior compared with the very best Android cameras, but personally I rarely need to zoom in more than around sort of 10 to 15 times, whether I'm shooting scenery or my family or whatever. Oh, and the low light shooting seems to have improved compared with when this phone first launched. So no more zoom pics that look like the loading page of a ZX Spectrum game, thank God. If you want to shoot some video, you can do so at up to 4K resolution at either 30 or 60 frames per second. You've got Apple's action mode if you are moving and shooting, but to be honest, you'll probably never need it unless you're literally strapping this phone to your bike or something. The regular stabilization is the mutt's nuts. Picture quality is top notch, while audio capture is also clean and clear, as long as it's not too windy. Overall, gotta say the iPhone 15 Pro Max, one of the best smartphones out there if you are shooting a lot of video. And last up, the iPhone 15 Pro Max's selfie camera is okay as long as you're shooting in decent light. Even with strong backlighting, your face won't appear drained of all colour, unless, like my good self, you are naturally as pale as Casper the f***ing Ghost. In bars, clubs and other low-light environments, you can expect lots of noise though, as well as a healthy dose of blur unless you keep your hand perfectly still. So yeah, very good luck if you've already had a couple of shandies. Now, one of the biggest smartphones to launch in 2024 in both a hype and also a very literal sense is Samsung's Galaxy S24 Ultra. This 6.8-inch Titan serves up all of the usual features, including a lush AMOLED screen and that nifty S Pen stylus. Plus you got plenty of grunt thanks to Qualcomm's Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, which is stuffed inside. Not to mention all of those AI-powered features that Sammy loves to bang on and on and on about. And Sammy's ultra-sized blower also bests the best optics of the S24 series, as you'd kinda hope for well over £1,000. And it's headlined here by a 200 meg main sensor with super quad pixel focus. I don't think Samsung's camera app is quite as user-friendly as Google's alternative on the Pixel smartphones, but it's still pretty good for your point-and-shoot style shenanigans, while offering a decent breadth of alternative camera modes. And certainly if you know your way around the likes of a DSLR, the likes of the Pro mode will come in very handy indeed, allowing you to tweak the likes of the EV levels, the ISO, the contrast level. You can also quickly flick between 12 and 50 megapixel images. And in Pro mode, you can choose to shoot a combination of RAW and JPEG. As if that wasn't enough, Samsung also offers up a dedicated Expert RAW mode. This gives you even greater control, and for some reason you've also got some astrophotography shenanigans. So yeah, certainly good if you want to experiment a bit more. However, I myself am a crap photographer, and so I did what most people will do on the S24 Ultra and just stuck with that full auto mode. Now, I've seen some issues over the past couple of months, similar to on the Pixel 8 phones. Mostly some weird artifacting, and usually when I'm shooting a portrait pic at 2x zoom or more. But almost every other time I get a good looking photo simply by pointing and shooting, even when the conditions are less than stellar. Now, when you're shooting a scene with a high dynamic range, a mixture of bright and dark areas, the Galaxy S24 Ultra is less prone now to pumping out oversaturated pics than with previous models. However, it most definitely still brightens up those darker areas iPhone style, so you do lose some of that eye-pleasing natural contrast. And that, of course, is an area where its big rival, the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, absolutely excels. But I found the Galaxy S24 Ultra is just about as hot when it comes to night shots, spaffing out photos with bright poppy colours that again lean more towards eye-pleasing than realistic. And when you want to get closer to the action, Samsung serves up a dual lens setup on the Ultra. That's a 10 megapixel telephoto lens with 3x optical zoom, plus a 50 meg effort with 5x optical zoom, which replaces the 10x zoom lens of previous generations. And this is one of the major reasons, besides the S Pen, to upgrade to the Ultra over the Galaxy S24 Plus. You can zoom in up to 100 times in total as usual, and Samsung's AI shindiggery once again steps in to artificially sharpen images. So even if you go a wee bit nuts, those pics aren't too fuzzy until you step past around the 30 to 50 times zoom level. which should be as much as you ever really need to zoom in reality. And now having that 5x zoom lens means when you zoom in just a little bit to snap your pets or your family without getting right up in their faces, you can still expect really sharp, really attractive results, depending on how attractive your pets and family are, obviously. I certainly reckon that's an improvement. And then the fourth and final lens slapped on the arse end of the Galaxy S24 Ultra is your standard 12 megapixel ultra wide angle shooter. There's no real difference here compared with previous Ultras. As usual, you're sacrificing a bit of tone and texture compared with the primary shooter. Those detail levels certainly take a hit, but sometimes those results are worth it. And for your video type shenanigans, well, you can capture up to 8K resolution footage at 30 frames per second on the S24 Ultra. Otherwise, dial it down to the likes of 4K level and you can shoot at 30 or 60 frames per second. Otherwise, Samsung offers up a dedicated Pro video mode where you've got all those usual Pro controls and a bit more control over the frame rate. As you can see there, you can bump 4K resolution up to 120 frames per second and 8K, choice of 30 or 24. But there's no option here for log capture, unlike the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. So if you're hardcore into your video stuff, you might want to go that way instead. Now, using the regular video mode, I was perfectly happy with the results when watching my footage back on a laptop. Samsung's Focus does a great job of keeping your subject sharp even when there's loads of potential distractions floating in and out of frame. And again, dodgy lighting, even in capture, HDR type situations, all rarely an issue. As with other big flagships, you can expect creamy smooth stabilization when wandering about and shooting, even with the super steady feature switched off. Meanwhile, that audio pickup is crystal clear from all directions, and even on gusty days, you don't get much irritating wind feedback. So certainly for shooting those family home movies, the S24 Ultra is well up to the task. And then last up, you've got a 12 megapixel selfie shooter slapped up there at the top of the mighty Galaxy S24 Ultra display. And it's perfectly fine at capturing still images of your face, if that's what you're into. Thankfully, Samsung does at least give you the option of covering up most of your visage with animated shit like this. You can even snap a photo of a cartoon dog doing a piss on your eyeball. Seriously, forget AI, this is the future. But speaking of which, of course, you've got that AI photo editing here on the Galaxy S24 Ultra, as with the rest of the S24 series, and it's definitely the best use of AI on this blower, as it was with the Pixel 8 phones. So for instance, the generative AI can straighten up a wonky shot that you took after perhaps a few too many beverages, adding in fake details around the edges as it does so, meaning you won't have to crop right in. You can also get rid of annoying stragglers from the background or remove reflections from pictures that you've taken through glass. And as always with this kind of AI type shenanigans, sometimes it is spookily good to the point where you're certain we're gonna all be slaves to robots in a matter of months. And sometimes it's a wee bit crap and just falls on its arse, but it's definitely well worth playing with as it can absolutely rescue an otherwise binnable shot. Now you could also poke the screen when watching back one of your videos and it will automatically turn into slow motion. It does this by basically generating extra frames and inserting them between the actual frames. And again, sometimes this can be pretty shonky, especially if there's any hand movement. It really doesn't like hands. Just AI in general just detests hands. And to be fair, when you've got the option of shooting 4K video at 120 frames per second on this thing anyway, I'd say just use that for all of your action videos. If you can't stretch to the slightly scary asking price of the S24 Ultra, you might find a good deal on last year's S23 Ultra. Despite Samsung's heavy processing, you'll still get some slick looking photos and excellent looking video with very little effort indeed. And the primary shooter here is Samsung's very own 200 megapixel HP2 sensor. This isn't as big as sensors found in rivals like the Xiaomi 13 Pro, but hands down this is one of the best smartphones for capturing memories and making them look really bloody good. Whether you're buggering about down the DIY shop or taking in breathtaking vistas on the other side of the world. And this is all just in full auto mode too, just point and shoot like those Pixel phones, no brain power required. By default, the S23 Ultra uses 16:1 pixel binning versus 9:1 on the old S22 Ultra, while also benefiting from Samsung's enhanced super quad pixel autofocus. This uses that 200 meg sensor to accurately determine distances and keep your subject perfectly crisp. And let me tell you, this phone almost never pumps out a fuzzy or blurry shot, even in the most tricky lighting conditions. You can boost colors and enhance textures with Samsung's Scene Optimizer mode, or go for a more natural vibe by shutting it off. That's completely up to you. The S23 Ultra is fantastic for capturing accurate tones with the portrait mode impressing even in proper low light. And as for HDR situations, well, the Ultra is again better than most of its peers, including the Xiaomi 13 Ultra. Only the Huawei P60 Pro has a slight edge in these high contrast circumstances. Speaking of the P60 Pro, that also has the Galaxy slightly beat when it comes to night snaps, but the S23 Ultra is a very close second. Low light pics still pack in a serious amount of fine detail, and this phone keeps noise at bay with a cocky swagger. Just make sure your subject is still, otherwise they might be a little bit blurred. And while colours might be a little bit boosted at night time compared with other flagships, this does allow for a more attractive final result. The 12 meg ultra-wide angle shooter is fine, though not as capable in darker conditions, especially again if there's any kind of motion. And you also have dual 10 meg telephoto shooters, one working at 3x optical zoom, the other offering 10x zoom. So you can pinch all the way in up to 100 times if you like. And that zoom lens is still among the greatest, on par with the Huawei P60 Pro in everything but more ambient lighting, where things certainly get a little softer and murkier here on the S23 Ultra. One camera phone that's a wee bit trickier to track down here in the West, but is well worth that extra effort, is the Vivo X100 Pro. And this may lack the sheer floor appeal of some of the other flagships, but it is brilliant in pretty much every way, from that long battery life and the smooth performance to the uncluttered software setup. And those optics also get my spurt of approval, even if the main shooter is just the same 1-inch Sony sensor as found stuffed inside of last year's flagship. As before, you'll get crispy pics no matter the lighting conditions, so even in snaps aren't grainy even when you're stuck in auto mode, while this blower also churns out natural looking tones rather than sprucing everything up. In addition, you've got that nifty Zeiss T-Star lens coating, so you'll see a lot less light related shindiggery such as flaring and haloing when you're shooting in brighter conditions. And the HDR chops are of course excellent, with next to no whitewashing when your subject's framed by a bright blue sky or some other harsh backlighting. The Vivo X100 Pro also spaffs out fantastic looking portrait snaps with a range of focal lengths. And even indoors you should get sharp looking pics with a selection of bokeh style blurring tools and accurate edge detection. Now Vivo has chucked in its very own V3 image processing chip, so you can snap portrait shots as quickly as you like and just instantly see the results. It's quite incredible just how fast this thing is. And while that primary sensor is Sony, the other two are Samsung and OmniVision efforts. So first up, there's an upgraded 50 megapixel ultra wide angle shooter. And this captures plenty of fine detail even in lower light, but the change in manufacturer does mean you'll get completely different tonal results. But still, it's more than respectable, can produce some good looking snaps. And last up, you've got a 50 meg floating telephoto lens, and this 100mm shooter kicks in at the 4.3x zoom level. And while those tones are once again less realistic than what you'll see with the main IMX989 sensor, the telephoto lens performs well across a range of conditions and is certainly a rival to the S24 Ultra and other flagship zoom efforts. Once you zoom in past the 30x zoom level, it swiftly becomes apparent that the X100 Pro is using some form of sharpening shenanigans to try and keep things from getting grainy, with sometimes mixed results. But it is rare that you'd really have to punch in much more than that anyway. And that V3 chip also boosts the video smarts here on the X100 Pro, allowing you to shoot up to 4K resolution video with a bokeh style background blurring again. And this can be a wee bit shonky of course, but it's there if you want to play around with it. Otherwise you can shoot up to 8K resolution video at 30 frames per second or 4K video at 30 or 60 FPS. As usual, I stuck with 4K resolution for my testing, and this produces some sharp looking footage with again reasonably natural looking colours. Flipping between the different lenses while shooting is a relatively smooth experience. You've got that versatility, while the stability is also good enough to keep your video from looking all wobbly. The audio does get rather muffled when conditions are windy, but otherwise no real complaints. Those mics do a decent job of picking up sound even a fair distance from the phone. And finally, the Vivo X100 Pro also has a 32 megapixel selfie shooter, and it's absolutely fine. Doesn't seem particularly perturbed by bright or cack lighting. It does a reasonable job with skin tones, or a complete lack of skin tone in my case. You can once again shoot up to 4K resolution footage at 30 or 60 frames per second with that selfie snapper. I've had no complaints whatsoever when I've been using the Vivo X100 Pro for Skyping or Zooming. Again, those mics do a respectable enough job. I'm also a massive fan of the excellent OnePlus 12, which is yet another flagship phone which ticks all of those boxes but for well under £1,000. And here the main shooter is a 50MP 4th generation Hasselblad camera. And accompanying this primary shooter is a 48MP ultra wide angle lens, and they've also got a fresh new 64MP periscope zoom with up to 3 times optical zoom. And at times, I've got to say, when using the camera, those sloped edges have again impeded my use of this phone. Occasionally, if I'm gripping the phone rather tight, I'll go to tap that shutter button and just nothing will happen. It'll be completely unresponsive. But thankfully, no real gripes when it comes to the picture quality. I really bloody love the natural looking results captured by the OnePlus 12. In that auto mode with the default settings, you should be more than happy with your photo collection. There's no aggressive color boosting, sharpening or other heavy processing on show. What you see in real life is generally what you get in your gallery, as long as you don't piss about and try to shoot into the sun or anything. And even so, this clever wee sod can cope with full-on contrast with only light saturation at times. It's also rare to see any kind of light flaring or other buggery when the sun is working against you. Even in more ambient light, those tones only occasionally stray into warmer territory. The OnePlus 12 is once again a dependable snapper churning out crispy pics. And at night time, there's no steep drop off in visual clarity or accuracy. Expect bright shots with next to zero noise unless we're talking proper pitch black situations. And that's with a fast shutter action too. And that portrait action as cracking as ever. You've got a choice of 1x, 2x or 3x zoom for your portraits. Of course, full control over the bokeh action. Now if you zoom in using the fresh telephoto lens, the results are again superb. That zoom actually maxes out at 120 times here, which kind of feels like OnePlus beating its chest and waving its willy right at Samsung. That's right, it's 20 times better. And in truth, photo quality remains surprisingly decent until you start to hit higher double digits, at which point everything kind of looks like a water painting done by a drunk toddler. But considering there's no 5x or 10x zoom lens here, it's certainly clever stuff. And it's even rather effective in the evenings. As for that ultra wide shooter, well, this is one of the better efforts I've tested on any smartphone recently. Mostly stepping in line with that primary shooter, although in low light it can fall down a bit. And when it comes to shooting home movies, well, no worries, you can capture footage at 8K resolution at 24 frames per second, although I tended to use the OnePlus 12 at 4K level because I don't have an 8K telly. And the video and audio quality is respectably good, more than good enough for capturing those precious family moments. Even at night you'll get fairly bright, sharp visuals rather than a murky, noisy mess. Digital stabilization is a little bit aggressive at that 4K level, so panning isn't as smooth as I would like. It is a wee bit stop-start at times, but you know, at least the view doesn't bob about the place as you walk. Zooming is relatively smooth, thankfully, with transitions that aren't too terrible as you flip from one sensor to the next. Although that change to the ultra-wide angle shooter is quite obvious at times, especially when the lighting is softer. And oh yes, before I forget, there is a 32MP selfie shooter slapped on the front end. And this churned out some good looking pics too, or as good looking as anything could possibly be, featuring my haggard hair-free head. Yeah, my pallid complexion perfectly captured. Those portrait smarts again work well. Now hands down, one of the most impressive camera phones launched last year was the Huawei P60 Pro. This gorgeous wee stunner unfortunately comes with the usual Huawei caveats, including a lack of Google services and 5G action. However, that battery life is sublime, the OLED screen is gorgeous, and there's more than enough power to run some slightly terrifying games with a satisfyingly smooth frame rate. But yes, the real highlight of the Huawei P60 Pro is definitely around back, and I'm not talking about that Rococo action. Now the primary shooter slapped around back is a 48MP effort with optical image stabilization. And like a very small number of other smartphones, this actually boasts a variable aperture lens. You can scale it all the way from f4 all the way down to f1.4. And it's got 10 different steps from f1.4 to f4, which really puts the Xiaomi 13 Ultra to shame. Now f1.4 is incredibly wide for a smartphone snapper, and this delivers some trouserially uplift and bokeh on demand. You can really see what a difference this makes right there on the screen. Just bump the aperture down to f1.4 and you'll see everything gets beautifully smoothed out in the background. However, you will have to jump into the Pro mode to actually adjust that aperture yourself. Otherwise on auto mode it's all handled for you. And on full auto mode, the Huawei P60 Pro does spaff out some stunning looking shots. You've got all of the usual AI shenanigans which can boost colours and highlight textures for specific subjects, which is especially noticeable when there's any kind of greenery involved in your snaps. Definitely knock off that Master AI mode if you prefer more realistic results, but I've got to say I rather liked the poppy outcome, which wasn't too severe at all. The P60 Pro serves up 12 megapixel photos by default, plenty of fine detail packed into every frame, and a supremely nippy shutter speed as well when the lighting isn't too cack, so perfect for shooting kids and other animals. And I've got to say, the HDR chops of the P60 Pro absolutely outstanding. They're definitely among the very best I've seen on any mobile, riding that very fine line between overexposing the background and underexposing your subject, even in the most ridiculously, stupidly tricky situations. This goat fella, or whatever he is, there's no way you should be able to see this much detail on the lad, right down to individual hairs. But like many flagship phones these days, the Huawei P60 Pro is all about that low light photography as well. And I certainly found that, again, in HDR style situations at night, the P60 Pro coped admirably. And while there is a certain amount of grain and noise introduced once the lighting gets really low, this thing is still impressive compared with many rivals. It can practically see in the dark. On the back end of the Huawei P60 Pro, you'll also find a 13 megapixel ultra wide angle shooter, which is fairly bog standard, but does the job if you want a more funky bit of framing or you just want to fit more into your photo. But the real treat is that 48 megapixel telephoto shooter, again with optical image stabilization, which is now better than ever in low light. I've got to say, results were impressive enough during the day. You can shoot an animal, a kid, whatever, from afar without interrupting them, disturbing them, so you can capture them going about their natural business. And things only start to look a little bit murky once you hit around the sort of 30 to 40 times zoom level. But even in low light, the P60 Pro could capture impressively crisp snaps from a distance with some pretty accurate color tones. And because the P60 Pro is so quick at capturing snaps, your subject doesn't even have to be completely still for the photo to look crispy and gorgeous. Oh, and there's also an obligatory telemacro mode, so you can shoot up close snaps without getting right in your subject's face. And plenty of other camera modes stuffed onto the P60 Pro, including a portrait mode. There's also a dedicated night mode, which to be honest I rarely touched because the general auto mode was so good in low light, but this does offer a longer exposure shot if you've got steady hands, just to brighten things up a wee bit more. There is actually an aperture mode as well, which you can use if you don't want to dive into the full-on Pro mode, but I usually just stuck with Pro. And plenty of other gubbins tucked away in there as well, usual AR shenanigans, bit of high-res action, although you don't need that to crop into your shots because you've got the telephoto. Now swap to video mode and you can shoot 1080p videos, 720p, otherwise 4K as well at either 30 frames per second or 60 FPS, but there's no 8K option. And I've got to say again, for me certainly, the Huawei P60 Pro smashed it for the video. It's really good at locking onto your subject and keeping them sharp, even if they're bouncing around like an absolute mentalist. The visuals really sharp and smooth. The audio capture's really good as well. You can pick up your voice clearly even with quite a bit of noise and chatter going on. Again, no issues with HDR style situations, pretty good in low light as well, and the stabilization is fantastic. And then last up, if you're into your selfies, your Instagrams, etc., you got a 13 megapixel front facing shooter, which again is pretty bloody good in a range of conditions. Even again with really stupidly tricky lighting, the P60 Pro can capture a good looking snap, keep you in focus and well saturated. Now another of my favourite 2024 flagship smartphones, so far at least, is the pleasingly dinky Xiaomi 14, which comes rocking top tier tech, including that Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 again. So you got that silky smooth performance. For something this size, it really bastes my beef. And yeah, the camera is another absolute belter, packed to the nipples with Leica goodness. So now you've got a 50 meg main camera with a Light Fusion 900 sensor and a Leica f1.6 lens. And apparently this arrangement can suck up 80% more light than the Xiaomi 13, which means brighter night shots despite a very nippy shutter speed. And certainly in low light conditions, my test photos were bang on. Finely detailed but not over sharpened, with a good stab at accurately reproducing those colours. In both good and bad light, I did get some blurry shots where my subject wasn't quite still enough, but those fuzzy pics were pretty much the only ones I had to chuck. Even strong contrast didn't make the Xiaomi 14 destroy its Y fronts in terror. You certainly won't see any blanching here. And when you're shooting in the photo mode, you've got a choice of either Leica Vibrant or Leica Authentic. So as you can see, easy to toggle between the two with just a quick tap up here. It can brighten up your pics, make those colors even more striking and bold, but I preferred Leica Authentic. Really love the natural, realistic look and results you get. And the Xiaomi 14 also boasts a 50 megapixel telephoto shooter, 32 megs of which can be used to capture images. And this is actually that floating 75mm Leica lens found on last year's Xiaomi 13 Pro, so it is a step up from the regular Xiaomi 13. This caps off at 60 times zoom rather than 100 times like the 13 Pro, and that is more than good enough for pretty much any situation, although photos do get a bit pixely above the 30 to 40 times area. It's once again great for low light shots, and here's some zoomy type situations for you to gaze at admiringly. And last up, you've also got yourself a 50 megapixel ultra wide angle shooter. And again, no complaints here from me. It is one of the better ultra wides out there, once again offering you a choice of Leica Authentic or Vibrant for that finish. You got consistent tones and accuracy when you switch to this from the primary shooter. And as always, as you'd expect from a Xiaomi Blow, loads of different camera modes and toggles to play around with, but I do like how neat and how one-handed friendly this app is. Bonus camera modes include, of course, the obligatory stuff, the likes of portrait, which works really well for capturing a nice bokeh style background effect. Naturally, you have yourself a dedicated Pro mode as well, again with loads of toggles. This includes the ability to shoot in RAW format, and you've also got a 50 meg high res option. And lots more camera modes, unsurprisingly tucked away in the More section, including that dedicated night mode. Although I found I didn't actually have to switch to that very often at all because the general photo mode worked really well. And you got a high-res 50 meg mode tucked away in there too. Now for your video related shenanigans, you can shoot 4K Ultra HD footage at 24 or 30 frames per second. That's with HDR enabled. If you knock off the HDR, you can actually bump it up to 8K resolution. For my test footage, I mostly stuck to 4K resolution at 30 frames per second with HDR enabled, and I was more than happy with the results here. That footage stays nice and stable, you got plenty of crisp detail chucked in there, and there's a quad mic setup on the Xiaomi 14 for picking up audio from every direction, and this works an absolute charm. Here's a good bit of test footage that I shot while pottering around Barcelona anyway, so you can check it out for yourself. Even in low light, it came out pretty bloody well. And then last up, my favourite, selfies, hooray! And you've got a 32 megapixel selfie cam stuffed on the front end of the Xiaomi 14. With usual voice shutter and palm shutter shenanigans. And yeah, I'm not the world's biggest selfie fan, but these photos seem to look okay. My face doesn't look too terrible. Certainly get plenty of finer detail, even in quite low light situations. All those lovely forehead lines still clearly visible. And if you wish to shoot some video with that front-facing selfie camera on the Xiaomi 14, well, it records at up to 4K resolution at 60 frames per second, Bananarama. And again, that audio pickup absolutely fine thanks to the quad mic setup. And if you happen to be absolutely loaded, well, another hot rival to the likes of the S24 Ultra is this here Xiaomi 14 Ultra, which ain't exactly cheap. This megaphone is another 6.8 incher, just like that Samsung S24 Ultra. And while there's no stylus shoved inside of a convenient orifice here on Xiaomi's monster, you do still get yourself a bugger load of very shiny tech. Excellent performance, long battery life, and some serious media chops make for an enjoyable, if trouser-bustingly big handset. And once again, Xiaomi has blessed this blower with some smarty pants Leica branded optics. This uses 4 Sony sensors. You've got a 50 megapixel primary shooter with an almighty 1-inch LYT 900 sensor, as also found in Oppo's Find X7 Ultra, plus ultra-wide telephoto and periscope options. It's a similar sort of arrangement to Samsung's Galaxy S24 Ultra, and I would just like to point out I didn't actually use the photography kit at all while I was testing out the camera for this review. Just wanted to use it in its raw naked form, get a feel for it just in case you don't fancy spending that extra cash. And thankfully the Xiaomi 14 Ultra isn't too uncomfortable to wield, and I didn't find my fingers get in the way of those camera lenses, mostly because it's such a huge chunk. And when you first open up Xiaomi's camera app, you are given a choice between Leica Authentic and Leica Vibrant, but you can quickly and easily swap between the two with a quick poke up here. So you can experiment with them, see which one's your favourite. And as usual, personally, I prefer the results with Authentic. I'm sure that plenty of others would like the Vibrant mode, which does help to brighten things up a bit, boosts those colours, and makes the UK look a bit less grey and crap. But the Xiaomi 14 Ultra's true photographic abilities lie in those HDR skills. The dynamic range here is pant-wettingly impressive, whether you're capturing a glorious beachy landscape in the sunshine or a neon-kissed scene at night. And even when you're shooting directly against the light, you can still expect well-balanced textured results, with deep blue skies, realistic colours and no signs of saturation. The Xiaomi 14 Ultra certainly impresses just as hard when it comes to low light pics, which still boast those natural looking tones despite the tricksy conditions, and only wee hints of grain here and there. One of the more unique features of the Xiaomi 14 Ultra's optics is the variable aperture, which I've only seen on a couple of other smartphones, including the Xiaomi 13 Ultra of course. In auto mode, this can automatically open and close to suit the conditions. Otherwise, you've got 4 steps you can choose from between f1.63 and f4.0. But if you stick the Xiaomi 14 Ultra into Pro mode, you'll find you've got much greater control over that aperture. And that's great news if you want to add a gorgeous bit of natural bokeh to your photo. And you've also got a dedicated portrait mode on here, which again offers a choice of filters and finishes. My favourite being the natural looking Leica portrait, even if it doesn't try and hide all of your sags and other mank. And the Xiaomi 14 Ultra also sports a 50 megapixel ultra wide angle shooter using Sony's IMX858 sensor. And this is generally just as reliable as the primary shooter, coping well with dodgy contrast and keeping those colours as realistic as possible. And the ultra wide can also focus on extremely close up subjects if you fancy a macro style shot. You've also got yourself a dual zoom lens setup on here, a 75mm telephoto shooter plus a 120mm periscope zoom, and these both again use that Sony IMX858 sensor as found in the ultra wide angle shooter. And in my testing, the Xiaomi 14 Ultra was just as strong as the very best rivals like the Samsung Galaxy S24 Ultra, getting you a crisp, clean shot even when you're bloody miles away. And this phone also sports an ultra zoom feature, which is basically a bunch of AI-driven image shenanigans that kicks in when you zoom in beyond 30 times. You can knock this off if you want by tapping the on-screen prompt, but it does help to sharpen things up a wee bit, even if it's nothing revolutionary. And if you swap to the video mode here on the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, where you can actually shoot up to 8K resolution footage at 30 frames per second or the more regular 24. However, if you want to use Xiaomi's swanky Master Cinema mode, where you can't do that in 8K resolution, you have to dial it down to 4K resolution at 30 frames per second. And with Master Cinema mode switched on, you'll capture gorgeous 10-bit HDR footage. This can help to counter any harsh lighting and make everything look crisp and clear. But you are limited to just the primary camera in this mode as well, no flicking between the different lenses allowed. Still, regardless of whether you switch on Master Cinema or not, you'll enjoy smooth footage thanks to Xiaomi's effective stabilization, as well as excellent audio pickup with minimal impact from any windy shenanigans. And there's also a separate movie mode which records in a more cinematic aspect ratio and chucks in a selection of filters and a couple of AI framing tools. Handy if you fancy yourself a bit of a Spielberg. Here's my personal masterpiece, cats pissing about in the garden. That movie mode is good for adding a quick bit of cinematic flair, but if you're dead serious about your video, well, definitely check out the director mode. Like the Pro Photo mode, you can play around with the likes of the white balance, you've got the autofocus controls, you can also mess around with the aperture to get that sexy bit of bokeh action on the go again. You can switch between the different lenses, and if you're dead serious about your editing, you want to get a very specific vibe in your editing suite, well, you can shoot log footage. And personally, my video editing skills are at kind of primary school level, as you can no doubt tell by watching this video, so I didn't even bother touching that. But for absolute amateurs like me, gotta say, really like Xiaomi's built-in video editing tools here. It's a great way of slicing up your footage on the fly, adding overlays and music and other bits, with none of the faff of, uploading your footage to a laptop or that kind of shenanigans, so any aspiring TikTokers will be absolutely creaming their kecks. And last up for the Xiaomi 14 Ultra's optics is that 32 megapixel front-facing selfie camera with autofocus, good bit of HDR, all that good stuff. And this is pretty bloody good too, even if you do get quite soft results in lower light. Here's some snaps of a bald bastard trying his best to look vaguely human. Enjoy. And that selfie camera can also shoot up to 4K resolution video, which is what I'm doing right now at 30 or 60 frames per second, so pretty good for your vlogging exploits, especially as the mics tend to do a pretty good job of picking up vocals and without too much background kerfuffle going on. And for a bit of extra cash, you can also grab a dedicated Xiaomi 14 Ultra camera kit, complete with an excellent grip, boasting a second battery and loads of buttons and knobs to fiddle with. It's ideal for photo enthusiasts, and I've done you a full dedicated video on that one if you're intrigued, so go give it a squint. Now, if you know your way around a DSLR, chances are you'll get on really bloody well with the Sony Xperia 1 Mark V. This feature-packed flagship boasts Sony's standard slick design. You got some fantastic tools for creators, a powerful gaming experience, and of course the usual professional camera tools that are a cut above the competition. Sony has partially overhauled the camera tech versus last year's model with a fresh new 24mm Exmor-T sensor chucked in. It's a 52meg sensor, but it does capture 12 megapixel images using a bit of pixel binning, and you don't have any choice in the matter. There's no ultra high res mode or anything like that. Now, when you first boot up Sony's Photo Pro app, this is what you're presented with, and it can certainly look a bit daunting if you're more used to a Samsung phone or an iPhone, for instance. But here in the basic mode, you've basically got a point and shoot style setup with a few extra features chucked in if you want them. Right here you can swap between all of the different sensors. You can tweak the brightness and the contrast levels. You've also got a bokeh option. You can turn on the burst mode with a quick tap of this icon here. You've also got a variety of filters to choose from, a small variety, 6 in total. You could also toggle the night mode, turn on the flash, and change up the aspect ratio. In Photo Pro, you can now also quickly and easily shoot some video, and Sony has also chucked in a new product showcase mode for video twats such as myself, who like to show off phones and various other items in their videos so it won't just focus on their face full time. If you want to do more than simply point and shoot, where you've got a variety of DSLR style modes, you can swap into the auto mode. This basically operates similar to the basic mode except with more of a DSLR style setup. However, the Xperia will still handle all of the tweaking of the controls and everything on your behalf, so it is still a case of point and shoot using that shutter button if you are holding it landscape mode. If you want a bit more control over your shot, well, just stick it into program auto mode and you can then piddle about with the EV levels and also the ISO levels, mess around with the white balance, etc. You've also got your shutter speed priority mode if you want to capture an action snap or get a really funky low light shot. And last up, a good bit of manual exposure. Now, the Xperia 1 Mark V's autofocus is enhanced with upgraded Clever Clogs AI algorithms to help keep your subject sharp even if they're bloody miles away, while AI is also used to calculate the white balance and adjust the exposure. And the great news is, for the most part, it works pretty chuffing well. If you just want to point and shoot and ignore the deep manual controls, well, the Mark V is good enough to pump out balanced, detailed stills that can be instantly shared. Don't expect this phone to make it like the Galaxy S23, however, and spruce up your pics with warmer tones to make food look more appetizing and flowers more flowery or anything like that. What you will get though is natural colour reproduction, so vivid subjects will often shine. Crazy contrast usually isn't a problem either. The Xperia 1 Mark V can't quite capture stunning bright blue skies as well as our pixels say, as the dynamic range isn't quite as strong, but very few of my snaps look like the colours had been bleached. Between the excellent face and eye autofocus and that burst shutter feature, capturing an action shot of your kids or your pets cocking about is pleasingly simple. The autofocus is, as always, a ruddy marvel, ignoring foliage and other matter which would trip up lesser devices. Plus, adding a gorgeous bokeh style blur is as easy as 2 quick taps as I previously showed, complete with a slider to max out or calm down the effect. Now, the Xperia 1 Mark V's fresh new Exmor-T sensor is apparently 1.7 times larger than last year's flagship phone, so it should be significantly better for the low light shooting. And certainly in ambient lighting you'll get pin-sharp photos and the picture quality doesn't get grainy until true darkness descends. But in auto mode, Sony's blower isn't quite as impressive as the Galaxy S24 Ultra or the Xiaomi 13 Ultra for night photography. But then that is where those pro controls come in, allowing you to mess around with the EV levels and also the shutter speed if you want some psychedelic results. And the Xperia 1 Mark V also sports a pair of 12 megapixel sensors. First up is a 16mm Exmor RS ultra-wide angle snapper, which is fine but not as consistent as that primary sensor for colour capture. You'll get some pretty awesome scenery shots, it's definitely a useful one for those pouncing about being a tourist moments, but it's nothing special. And last up is a variable 85 to 125mm Exmor RS telephoto shooter, and this allows you to zoom in up to 15.6 times in total.
It's certainly no space zoom, and even at that limited maximum range you'll still get quite fuzzy results, while the telephoto shooter also struggles a bit in quite bright light, as well as softer light when you're indoors or in the evening time. So overall, the extra options outside of that spangly new XMOT sensor are a bit of a letdown compared with, for instance, the Pixel 7 Pro, the Samsung Galaxy S24 Ultra, etc. The Cinema Pro app acts exactly as before. You've got full control over the focus, which sensor you're using, and all the various other settings as well. Video maxes out at 4K resolution as usual. There's no 8K option here, but you could once again shoot Ultra HD footage at up to 120 frames per second with all three lenses for impressive flexibility. Bearing in mind that colors and detail levels can take a bit of a hit when you're swapping outside of that main sensor. Focus is usually excellent unless there are many faces in shot, in which case the Xperia can get a bit confused unless you specifically tap to target one subject. Understandable enough. You can even get some decent nighttime results, although any strong lighting does tend to be blown out. And also make sure you choose stereo audio pickup from the video settings if you want to include a bit of commentary in your videos, otherwise your voice will sound quite faint. And last up is that 12 megapixel selfie shooter, and it's a pretty solid effort again, certainly for those quick and dirty shareable shots. Even bright backgrounds don't bollocks up your snap, and even when you're lingering in murkier climes, the Xperia 1 Mark V can still suck up a respectable amount of detail and reasonably close skin tones.
And last up, yet another rather impressive flagship phone launched in 2024 is the Honor Magic 6 Pro, which rather shockingly is another 6.8-inch mega bastard packed with premium tech. Bet you never guessed that one. This includes, that old favourite, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 for meaty everyday performance, as well as a ruddy massive battery for all-day play. Now when it comes to the camera tech, Honor has gone for a completely different approach to the old Magic 5 Pro. So that main shooter in the Squircle setup is now a 50 megapixel OmniVision OVH 9000 sensor with optical image stabilization. And that shutter speed is as fast as you like, and the Magic 6 Pro can actually take shots automatically on your behalf whenever it detects motion from the likes of cats and kids, if you really can't be asked to push the shutter button yourself. Of course, as you might expect, this can be a bit hit and miss, indiscriminately snapping away. You're best off just tapping that shutter button yourself when the moment is just right. And like a small selection of other flagship phones, that main lens actually has a variable aperture, can flick between f1.4 and f2.0, which is quite a limited range compared with some rivals from the likes of Huawei and Xiaomi. But still, if you jump into the Pro mode in the camera app, you do actually have full control over that aperture, so you can manually flick between f1.4 and f2.0 to suit the situation. And there's quite a subtle adjustment to the likes of the bokeh style effect, given just how close those aperture settings are. But the Magic 6 Pro can also automatically switch apertures for brighter low light pics, and certainly most of my night snaps came out really well, as long as your subject freezes, because despite the nippy shutter speed, you will get a blurry photo if there's any kind of motion. Colors are correctly captured and there's not much noise at all, so even on a big screen, your low light pics should look reasonably sharp. You'll also get crisp, reasonably natural looking photos in ambient light, while my outdoor shots are packed with vivid colors and fine detail. Even with rather test and contrast, the Magic 6 Pro rarely fails to focus, and it usually spaffs out pleasingly balanced results. I found the portrait shots also often come out well, although wild hair and fuzzy subjects are smoothed out to quite an extreme degree. But of course, it's not just that 50 meg main shooter on here. The Magic 6 Pro also serves up a couple of alternative cameras, including a bonkers 180 megapixel periscope shooter. Unfortunately, the 2.5 times optical zoom lags behind many other flagships and even last year's model, and the unusually high megapixel count doesn't really make up for it, as it's using those MPs for pixel binning to keep your pics bright and bold. Even with Honor's post-processing shenanigans to sharpen things up, you will notice that things get kinda grainy kinda fast beyond the 10 times zoom level. So yeah, definitely do not bother pinching into anywhere near the 100 times maximum zoom. And yeah, just in case you were wondering, you can actually shoot a 180 megapixel photo with that zoom lens if you swap to the high-res mode. But this doesn't actually seem to have much of a positive impact on the detail captured. If anything, you usually just end up with a slightly washed out image. And last up is a 50 meg ultra-wide angle shooter which spaffs out decent pics even when the light is a bit cack. It's only properly in the evenings that it's not really worth bothering with. Now swap to the video mode on the Magic 6 Pro and you can capture up to 4K resolution footage. There's no 8K option here, but to be fair, it always feels like kind of overkill on a smartphone. And besides, Ultra HD video recorded on the Magic 6 Pro looks good, with colours again slightly boosted so vivid scenes really slap. Stabilisation is good enough to counter both handshakes and any general motion, so don't feel like you have to freeze up while you're shooting. And yeah, you can easily flick between the different lens options whenever you like, with minimal disruption to that picture. And no complaints on the audio front either, it's a really solid setup. And then last up front, you've got that dual lens arrangement. You've got a 50 megapixel selfie shooter plus a time of flight sensor as well for 3D face matchmaking shenanigans. You'll want to keep your hand and your face as still as possible in softer light or you will end up a bit fuzzy, but besides that, it certainly does the job for all of those glamour pics. And there you have it, my lovelies. As you can see, quite a lot of excellent camera phones launched already in 2024. But did I miss out your own personal picks? Well, definitely clue me in as to what a massive dingleberry I am down in the comments below. Let us know what you would have chosen. I've only included stuff that I've personally tested and reviewed. And also, if your budget can't stretch to any of these absolute monsters, well, no worries. I've also rounded up my favourite budget-friendly camera phones. It's a separate video. Go check that out if you want to save a bit more cash. Right, enough banging on for me. I'm off for some scran, but definitely please do poke subscribe, ding that notifications bell, tell all your friends, and have yourselves a bloody wonderful rest of the week. Cheers, everyone. Love you.